Greetings. This video is a little bit overdue, but I'm grateful to God that I'm able to do it now. And there are two specific groups that I would like to dedicate it to and to acknowledge that they are the real heroes of this story. One group is those that I owe money from more than 13 years ago. That's how long it's been since this ordeal started. And the second group is the one that has supported me financially. So I'm grateful to both. And so this is a time when the Hebrew year is about to begin. The new year is soon approaching. And this is a time to put matters straight before the Lord. So I mentioned in the very first video that I posted on YouTube that the group that has tormented me for all these years, I really don't focus on them. I don't talk about them. I don't think about them because I left the matter to the Almighty. But they still pop up in my life, like in this case, because I've not been able to meet my financial obligations, especially the debts that I owe. And it has to do with that group. So I need to, I owe the people that I am indebted to this kind of explanation. Plus, those who have supported me, they need to know that I wasn't just irresponsible, but there were reasons why I wasn't able to, meet my own basic needs. So I think I'll begin around 2010. I returned from my graduate studies overseas, armed with what had really motivated me to undertake those courses. And my interest has always been economic development. So I hope to do a separate video now. Those who have seen my profile, I've been mentioning Project Prosperity. So I owe that video as well. So my concern was the levels of poverty in Africa are not acceptable. And I did believe, and I've always believed, that we don't have to live with that kind of misery. So it's really a human-made problem. And so I already had a public service position. So when I returned to Uganda, I went to my former bosses. I call them former bosses because we already had issues. Right from the time I was applying for the economic development courses, I was told I should not apply. And I need to mention again, these are really few individuals. It has nothing to do with the entire public service system. So these are isolated individuals. Unfortunately, they wield more power than the rest of, those who would be making the decisions. And you will see why, because I hope to show that there is a network that goes all the way to Europe. Now, those who had the authority over me, one of them said I should not apply, I should not go to study. But my overall boss had no problem with it. And in fact, he was really supportive. And right from the time of application, because the application forms require, signatures of supervisors and bosses. So the overall boss said, well, I don't supervise you. Go to your supervisor, let him fill the form, and I will sign. And I think the supervisor felt cornered, so he actually signed the forms. But he had made it clear he was not happy about it. So even before I returned to Uganda, I knew my position was really not firm. So I knew if I couldn't be taken back in, I could use my qualifications elsewhere to help people. And so when I returned, I went back to the same, offices that do the deployments, and I was deployed without a problem. Now, the problems arose after that. Now, there were other incidents I need to mention. One of them, a human resource person came to me to tell me my supervisor had complained to them prior to my travel for studies. And when I went to the supervisor, it was like, so and so also. He didn't have any explanation for me. So I knew there were people under duress, people under pressure, and so I was walking on eggshells in a nutshell. Now, one of these HR people shows up again when I'm already deployed. And he has I don't know if it's a request or a command. So he says I should not claim salary arrears. Now, when I went for studies, my salary was blocked. And I needed it for my upkeep. This is why the financial issues have been all over my life this whole time. So, but by the grace of God, I was able to complete my course and to return to Uganda. And now they're asking me not to claim salary arrears, which is part of, the whole process of getting back onto the payroll, was a bit problematic for me. But it wasn't justified, and it didn't make sense. So I simply explained, look, I have debts. I had financial obligations before and during my studies, and I owe people money, so I need this money to pay off the debts. But it became an issue. Now, I need to mention someone was treated this way for 9 years. When he was back into public service, he went without a salary, 9 years. And so when he told me this, I knew I could not risk even 6 months. Anyway, it was difficult for me. But so there's this issue of money, it shows up in a different way. And now I need to cut this story short to bring in that story of how money in government departments or, how it becomes problematic. Now, even before I traveled for my studies, I'd taken leave and undertaken a consulting assignment in Tanzania around 2006, end of 2006. Now, it was really an abrupt thing. The guy who was meant to do it called me and he said he couldn't travel, so he asked if I could get leave and take his place, and that's what I did. And so the team he was to lead went to Tanzania, to the areas of Mbeya, Iringa, and I think Tunduma is I don't know to remember if it's a different region. So there are regions and there are cities and there are districts. So 2 main regions, Iringa and Mbeya. Now in Mbeya city, this is where I encountered this thing about money. The city manager had books of accounts that were a mess. And she was a soft-spoken woman that was a bit slow, and I actually thought she was struggling to fit in the position. And my advice was simple. I said, you are the manager, you are permitted to pay for the services of private providers that will come in and help you to clean up your books of accounts. This is it talks about money revenues and how the money is spent. And so I thought it was straightforward. I would make my report and show what it is that was not done right and what she needed to do to improve. What I did not know is that she was actually doing it deliberately, but that she was not alone. So that very evening, she sent items to my hotel room. They included perfumes and clothes. And there's no way I would take them. And I did not want to take them back to her. How to do it was problematic. So I called the overall team leader in Dar es Salaam and explained what had happened. And he advised me. So actually, I didn't know that, but he did. He called the ministry, Tanzanian ministry responsible, and we were advised to keep the items. So I kept the items, took them back to Dar es Salaam at the end of the exercise, and unfortunately the perfume fell and the bottle broke, and so it was useless. But the clothes, we handed them over to the ministry. So we proceeded. We had several other places to go to. So we went all the way up to Tunduma. I remember Tunduma and Lake Malawi, on the shores of Lake Malawi. So just before we left Mbeya City, a European man showed up. His name is Stephen. The second name is a little bit difficult for me because I don't remember the order of the vowels, but I think it sounded like Hovole. And he was an advisor for the city and the district. So we did discuss this. He actually invited me to a dinner. We were busy the whole day, so I could only meet him in the evening. We had dinner. He showed up a few times, but he showed up out of the blue. And I thought it had to do with his concern for the local governments. That was number one. And two, that he cared for the city manager in particular. So I explained to him what I'd said. I don't remember who of the two said it, but it was said to me that she had, the city manager had a daughter in Massachusetts, I think in college, and she was spending a lot of money, which is the first suggestion that she might have been using money from the office to run her own private life. So I explained to them what I'd already told the manager, that she needed to clean up the books of accounts, bring in those that she didn't have, and have qualified people help her to post them, make sure that they balance. And so that was the exchange. We didn't really talk much, except Stephen mentioned to me that he owned, he co-owned a plot of land on Lake Malawi with a Tanzanian. Tanzanian law requires that foreigners have local partners in such ownerships. So that was it. Now, during my time in the US for studies, he kept in touch. This man, Stephen, he kept in touch, and he always asked me when I would be returning. By then, he was in Congo. So we met in Tanzania, now he's in Congo. And I actually thought, just networking, wants to find out what I'm up to, what I've studied, and all that. So I didn't really pay much attention to it. Except now I returned to my public service position. And I had, so first of all, I was denied a salary for 3 months. So I knew, and remember I've mentioned someone who was denied a salary for 9 years. So there's no way I was going to keep in that environment. Plus, the demands really didn't sound reasonable. They didn't sound to make sense to anyone, to say, don't claim salary arrears, because it didn't make sense. So when it became obvious, and by the way, I am mentioning this like I said, for the sake of those that I owe money and those who have supported me. So each of these people that I am mentioning, except Stephen, he showed up, and even when he was talking to me, I didn't understand. But all the people that have affected me negatively, before I gave up on them, I always went back to them more than once to say, is there a way we can resolve this? So I owe none of those people. I don't really feel responsible in any way, and I bear no grudges, no anger, because like I said, I cleared with every one of them and left the matter to the Almighty. I always went back to each one of them. So when this HR guy was insisting I should not claim arrears, now he had my overall boss in my new position making unreasonable demands and threats, making it clear that he was going to deal with me. So I had to leave public service. So it was a very painful ordeal, because it's a long process, having to write and wait for decisions to be made. So it was a very difficult, a very, very, very painful experience. And so this is where the help of those who sacrificed. I know most of them don't earn much, so it's really self-sacrifice, because they fed me, they clothed me, they paid my rent, even before they paid their own rent and bought their own food and, provided for their families. So I'm really grateful. Now, I'm bringing up this because after the ordeal, this European man, Stephen, shows up again. He called me on phone. So I mentioned we met in Tanzania. He had been in Congo the whole time I was for studies, which is close to 3 years, because I had some extra research to do before I returned to Uganda. And now, as I was about to exit public service, he shows up again. And I think he had projects he was running in the western part of the country of Uganda. And he referred to the incident in Tanzania as if saying I was paying for that. He reminded me how I had caused the city manager to lose her job. So again, this is for the Lord Almighty to judge, because I don't think I was responsible for the manager's loss of her job. But now you see how, so it's really, and of course I've mentioned the arrears, my own, plus the guy who was denied a salary for 9 years. Now, so I'm connecting this for people to see how the leakages, the loss of, much needed resources out of Africa are channeled with people who can't make their own decisions, really. They are made to do what they do, and then how these resources are instead used against the people in a very destructive way. So I think I would rather not speculate, or I have an idea, but I would rather not, lead people into thinking in a certain direction. But they should just ask themselves. So these funds that are channeled out of the public structures, where are they channeled to? So this is something of, as you can imagine, it affected me, but also the more I see the poverty, I'll get into how they followed me, because this should have ended by 2013. So I should be free by now to live my life, run my projects, do what I want to do. And remember, I mentioned that I did this video. The second group of people that I did it for is those that have supported me all these years. Why is it that I haven't been able to run my own life the way I want? And before I get into that part, how they've pursued me since 2013, I thought I needed to talk about now those resources, the misery that we witness. So this is what motivated me to go for studies in the first place. And it's still prevalent, so it's still affecting me on a daily basis. The misery that I see, I am sure it reaches heaven. It's just not acceptable. It's not right. It's so bad. So even before I get to how much, some examples of what it looks like on a, personal day-to-day basis, I have been wondering who does this to people and why. Now, of course, it's not Stephen alone. There are many other individuals involved, and their networks, and some of them they run through very structured, very organized, but criminal enterprises or organizations. But there's one specific thing that is obvious out of all this. Now, if hospitals don't function, schools don't function, of course, the most vulnerable group will suffer the most. And this will be children, the elderly, and those who are really, really ill or sick, are unable to defend and to provide for themselves. So just a few Shabbats back, and usually I am showed a lot on the, that period of Shabbat, but this particular weekend I didn't see a lot. And I felt like this had been, less rich Shabbat. Except now, as I was pondering this question, so who is it that enjoys hurting Africa's children this much? Something came to mind. In Deuteronomy 25:17, the Lord commands Israel to destroy Amalek and not leave any survivors, no memory. And he gives the reason. So he says, when Israel was moving from Egypt to the promised land, Amalek was not far behind, close, just not short distance away, and always striking those who are struggling behind. So we meet Amalek again at the time of Saul in the book of Samuel, when Saul was commanded to destroy them completely and he failed. Amalek shows up again in the book of Esther, in the person of Haman and those around him. So two things that stand out. One is that closeness, not really like the one in charge, but not far off real power, very, very close to power and authority, but very devious, and yet always aiming for the children and the most vulnerable. So I hope this makes sense. Really, that was my biggest discovery. I was like, so this is Amalek in Africa, always aiming for the vulnerable and the children. And I think when people begin to look around, they'll see them. They're all over. They're not difficult to see. So we learn a lot from the story of Haman in the book of Esther. He was very powerful. He was number 2. And everybody worshipped him except Mordecai. And that bothered him. So he wanted to deal with Mordecai. But then he decided no, he wanted to go for even the children and the most vulnerable. So he destroys, but like anyway, I think you get the point. So as I was thinking about this, of course, I've mentioned research again and again, and I'm grateful. I've been planning to do a specific video about the US and how they've contributed to freedom and, you know, progress for humanity. But before I get to that, so that research, for me, the pre-colonial history of Africa is very vivid. And so again, I'm grateful to those who have contributed. And what stands out, people who have not read this history will not realize this, that again, there was a targeting of children and the most vulnerable. So most people focus on the strong and the healthy that were put in chains and you know, sent overseas. But the devastation that was done to the children, the women who couldn't run, or, you know, pregnant women and groups like those. So it was like they were hunting wild animals, what we're doing. And then the children that survived the massacres, they were put in what the Jesuits called ferme chapelle. Ferme chapelle is French for chapel farms or church farms. Even the name suggests, you know, how lowly they treated these people. And so gratitude to the very brave. By the way, people need to realize that a good part of, you know, the faithful Europeans, even in the US, especially in the US, they objected to the horrors of you know, either the way the slaves were captured or just the whole idea of you know, the way they were held in slavery. They objected. They fought. The American Civil War was largely about one group wanting to stop slavery and another that wanted to hold on. Now, the irony is that those that wanted to hold on to slavery are the very groups that are present in Africa, and they're just going on like nothing has happened. So I would recommend, there's a very accessible literature by Ed Morel. Now, there are two Ed Morels. There's the one of the US, he was more like, you know, he was into comedy. But there's Ed Morel, if you search for it with the Congo Reform Association. His partner was executed. But you can imagine the brave souls that would, you know, expose these kinds of horrors. So, but then, so what the trouble is, what is done to the children, even those who are put into institutionalized arrangements. So there's something called socialization. That should be the positive, the way we are raised with values and beliefs and, you know, that sense of, like, these things that shock humanity that we think are unacceptable. Now, unfortunately, those who are channeled into those other negative forces, they grow up without these values, and so they become very ruthless, and some of these actually lived through the colonial system, and they're responsible for some of the atrocities as well. So this is again what has been lying a little bit below the surface, just waiting for a moment to explode and cause untold suffering to humanity. So if I express gratitude to the Lord the whole time, people need to understand this is what it is about. So I've mentioned my ordeal should have ended 2013 if my problem was with my tormentors was the public service position. If I left the public service position, then I should be left alone. It wasn't about the public service position. It had to do with my very existence was a problem. And it took me a while to understand why. So 2013, I went to those who had been supporting me this whole time. Very brave individuals, by the way, because I didn't owe them anything. They didn't have to support me. And I don't know what, you know, what heavenly anointing is upon them. But somehow they took it up as their own cause and they supported me. And so it was a difficult ordeal, very difficult, painful experience. And it took me some years to really, you know, compose myself and try to start all over. Meanwhile, so 2011, 2012, when I got the final communication that I was out of public service, I was already out. So this shameless people came to me. They were like, yeah, but the few months you spent in government, you should have been paid. Go to court to claim that money. So you can see that kind of attitude. But I understood I didn't have to fight for that as well. I decided to let go. I wanted to just have a fresh start in life. So for those years, 2010 really to 2013, I was completely dependent on donations. 2013, I decided I was ready to start over. I didn't even know how. I didn't know how to begin. And obviously, I had offers of employment even before I returned to Uganda, and I had turned those down. And 2 or 3 years down the road, a lot of things have changed, so I couldn't even claim those, and I never went back to them. So I'd always wanted my whole life to run a school. Now, of course, anyone who has, anyway, I felt like that was my really something, what would really give me fulfillment. And so I thought this was the time. If I couldn't do it for every fellow citizen, then maybe I could do it for the few that I could access. So my idea was move to a community, write project proposals, get funding, and run a school alongside other community improvement projects. So the Lord showed me a place, and it happens to be my ancestral place. And again, these shameless people want to claim it as their own, but they couldn't. So I was safe. They tried to really kick me out. I was like, no chance. This is my ancestral place from hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I moved in. That was 2013. This is why I keep mentioning 2013. Now, 2013 to sometime in 2014, I was really cooling down, trying to recover, and getting acquainted to the place. We don't have, immediate family, though there are extended families, but no immediate family. So I needed to get acquainted to the people, the environment, and really figure out how I wanted to do what I wanted to do. So 2014, the Lord told me to start a school. And I was told that the children would help me, lift me up spiritually. And I owe them a debt of gratitude as well. Children are wonderful. I've learned a lot from them. Non-judgmental, grateful, and they express that gratitude so easily. Open-minded. But also they gave me hope for the future. So 2014, towards the end, I returned to Kampala to my former colleagues. I'm grateful to them. I went with a pledge list, explained what I needed to do, and got contributions to start a school. These were not huge amounts, but I was like, maybe the Lord wants us to start humble. So I felt okay with it. And indeed, we did get started. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in the beginning. And then the negative campaign started. And this is why I tell the story, because it's really sad. So those who came to me, they had stories, their own stories. Plus they would tell, stories of their neighbors and their friends and relatives of how much they endured. One of the things that was pointed out was the lack of food. I remember there was this young mother. It was her first daughter. She was about 2 years, so this is really not a large family, like they can't take care of themselves. And I mentioned to her that what would bother me would be if parents did not feed their children. And they shouldn't give them leftovers from the night before. It should be fresh food. So my number one concern was feeding. And she kept on and on. She's like, some people can't afford to feed their families. I was like, no, that's not possible. Okay, I was like, okay, if there's no fresh food, maybe leftovers. She's like, no, some can't even give you leftovers from the night before. So it is sad. And I lived to see that myself. The second one, I've mentioned in my blog, a very old woman that came to me. I didn't tell the whole story, but so she brought her youngest granddaughter. Her grandchildren, the mother had died, and the dad, being a drunkard, could not help them. So she was, majorly responsible. The older children were already in schools nearby, so she brought the youngest, about a little bit under 3. And so she had struggled, feeding the family, leave alone raising the money for tuition. And I remember one time she said, she was like, okay, after you feed our children, our grandchildren, you'll feed us as well. So she had hope. But midway through the year, she never brought back her granddaughter. She didn't explain. And when we met, she said the school where the older grandchildren were, they offered a scholarship for the youngest. I knew that couldn't be true because no private school, even the one I was trying to establish, was to run on, funding donations. So I knew there's no way a struggling private school could afford to provide scholarships for 4 children plus. But some of the I don't know what to call it, but some of the effort to frustrate the school was even channeled through the local council. Now, the law requires every local government to have a committee for OVCs, orphans, and vulnerable children. So those from, families that are unstable, that need extra help. So I was invited to one meeting and I was told I was a member of that committee. I think it didn't exist before and I don't think it existed after. And there was this young woman, she was saying she grew up as an orphan, and she was saying there are many ways that orphans could be helped. They did not need. She was suggesting they didn't need my help. And I was ready to give them whatever advice I would give to the committee, but that committee never met again and it never did anything. And I could see the arrogance. Some people have it nice, and for others it's complete death. I call it death, and here is why. This old woman that removed her grandchild, many, so we began first term, we began with close to 60 children. By end of second term, most of them were gone. By the end of the year, I think about 30 to 40 were gone. And many of them, they came back to explain why. I mean, some of these are very horrible things that were done to families that are difficult to explain. Like, scares. One would say, well, they're going to sacrifice your children, child sacrifice, as you can imagine. And people were horrified, all sorts of stories. So the particular old woman, I like her story to tell it. Not that I like the story, it's sad, it's horrible. So that was 2016, 2015, 2016. By 2022, now not only has the youngest child dropped out of school, all the others have dropped out of school. And by now they are teenagers. But that youngest has been defiled. And then she came to me to tell me the story. I was like, why does she have to do this to me? And then I realized maybe she has no one else to tell. And then she had to take me through the whole ordeal of what was done to the grandchild and why, and it's horrible. So this is how lives have been lost. Now, the older grandchildren were advised to go to look for employment. These are children who have dropped out of lower primary school. They didn't even complete lower primary, so they can't read, they can't write, and so then they take them away to look for employment. So I need to leave this story at this because it's even painful. The things I've seen and I've experienced and witnessed are really horrible. This is why I was like, so why do people do this to other people's children? So yeah, I think you can see there's human trafficking, there's just outright destruction. But the end result was actually going to be much worse. So I am grateful to the Lord that He didn't let us have to live to that, and that He has removed the evil from our midst. But yes, so that was Amalek has been busy, but Amalek has been destroyed. Now, I think I was bringing along 2 stories. So I've told about the school. Now I need to break it a bit. This is where you'll see how Amalek has been destroyed and why some people will go with Amalek and some won't. So by 2017, I had very few children. Like they were all from the same family, but that very family also had failed to meet some of the contractual obligations on their part. My understanding, as I mentioned, was feeding. And then I would have gone on. People have supported me to this far, so they would have continued to support me and the school as we write for larger grants. But then this family, the person responsible was not, doing the things she had promised to do, and they were doable to feed the children. And I felt like it was, not possible for me to proceed. But so when I broke off, I wasn't sure that the school project was, it's really a break. I can't say I've left the school project because I will resume the school with my own children. So the school project is still alive, but on hold. So I left 2017 to go to Nairobi to ask for help. Now, I had been blocked from travel before. I would ask for explanations. I would not be told why. I would reach the Kenya border and I would be told, go back. I was like, why? No explanation. And the guy would just get more and more agitated and aggressive. So I saw no point in arguing. Plus, I knew that these were receiving orders from above without even knowing where the orders were coming from. And then at some point, my passport was confiscated. Again, I tried to follow up. Unfortunately, those who would be having authority would also act like they don't actually have authority. So I would get no help. And then I would see no point in, following up again and again, expenses, transportation, feeding, accommodation, and yet I didn't have the money. So I stopped following up getting my passport. I stopped following up, trying to get to Kenya through the border points. And this time I decided I would go to visit, relatives in Rwanda and then proceed through Tanzania to Kenya. I would have flown. Again, I didn't have a passport. Plus, I found I was short just a little money for the air ticket for the time I wanted to travel. So I went by road via Tanzania. Now, just before I left Kigali at that time, just to show you what kind of people are really we live around. These guys would come and fill up the tables around me. I went to a restaurant. And then they are arguing among themselves and quarreling. And this one of them was like, she doesn't even have a phone. I didn't have my phone with me at the time. She doesn't have even a phone. If she enters one of these world compounds, how will we trace her? In my presence, sitting in front of me. So I could see the impunity, the arrogance, but also the futility of what they're trying to do. Anyway, so I never answer those. I never, bother about them. So I proceeded. And there was a group that traveled with me on the bus the whole way from Kigali to the Tanzania border. These were little boys, teenage boys singing, like war songs. Like they had won. They believed they had won. And they mentioned which group they came from, and really sad story. This is why I keep mentioning the children, Amalek and the children. So I got to the Tanzania border. I explained my predicament, and the officers at the time told me to wait because they needed to consult their superiors. So I ended up spending about a month, 2 months, maybe 2 months in the transit center. And then I was told I needed to go via a refugee camp to, now I was told I was stateless. This is the East African community, but issues of passports, Tanzania and Burundi are not involved. So it made sense to me since I was already, going to a third country, and I was like, if I didn't get the immediate help I needed, maybe I might need that extra help. Now, I've stayed away from speaking about the UNHCR, so someday maybe when it warrants, I'll do one. But for now, I'll not go into the details, but I went to Nyarugusu refugee camp. So I'll go into a little bit of those details again to show the insecurity and the predicament of the children in the camps. Now, on arrival in Nyarugusu camp, it was late afternoon, so by evening, the people we found in the transit center, now it's a reception center. These are very big tents, and you can imagine a place with hundreds of thousands of refugees. So these are really, really many tents. But now those in the reception center, the massive tent called the reception, they came to me. So I got a mattress. Where I had been in the transit center, I somehow I found my, the cement floor was affecting me. So I'd got a mattress, small, maybe 3-inch mattress. So in the reception center, I was told, even if I slept on that mattress, that the gangs would come, they would cut the plastic sheeting, get in, remove me, and carry the mattress. Plus, they said all sorts of horrible things about how unsafe the place was. And you could really see the horror on the women and the people around. Now, I was a little lucky that I said I spent longer in the transit center. So some of the people I had been with had already arrived, and some, I don't know how, but they got wind that I was coming. So they decided I would not spend the night in the reception center, and so they came for me. So by the time they came, the horror. So I'll get back to the horror in the camps in this next story in Kenya. But so in the places I was in 3 different places in Tanzania. And I need to mention one Burundian refugee. We met again in a transit center when he was coming out of prison. And I think it was his second prison time because he was lamenting, he was really grieving for his children. So before he left Burundi, his wife had died. And so he was a widower looking after his children. And now he had lost the children. He didn't know where they were. So when he was arrested the first time, the children were taken and he did not know who had taken them. He tried to follow up the wife's family, his own family in the camps. He couldn't find those children. That was in Tanzania. I met a Ugandan woman in Kenya with even a more sad story because she was, I think they attempted to sodomize. I'm not sure. She said she was sodomized in front of her grown sons. And she was grieving for her missing daughters. Now, but the sad story about the Burundian refugee is that he had been a child soldier in the jungles of the Congo, the Burundian rebels. And he had his own trauma, like he couldn't get over the things he had seen and done, especially what he had done. So if he freely told me how he they raped, they practiced cannibalism, horrible things. And he had left his original faith, I don't have to mention it, and tried finding solace in other religions. So he was telling me all this, asking me to pray for him. Now, by then, of course, the Lord told me, you think you're dealing with a human being. This is what I was told. You think you're dealing with a human being. You think you're talking to a human being. So this is what is done to the children. They go into these jungles as small children and look what they grow up into. But the guy was really troubled. I don't know how his story ended, but I could see someone in complete grief. I tried to advise on what he needed to do. I am not sure he could do it properly. Only the Lord knows how his story ended. Now, I was in transit. I needed to get to Kenya. And someone showed up. He was camp manager. By the time I'm trying to get out, he's actually promoted to deputy regional coordinator. And he was telling the refugees, he's already dead. So, and the Lord knows to judge between him and those who spoke about him. But the reports coming from refugees to me were that he was saying, I would never leave Tanzania. I don't know why. I've never met this guy. I didn't know him. But somehow he felt he needed to have authority over my life. In fact, I left the day I was called to, get my papers and get out of Tanzania. He was already dead. So maybe as long as he lived, I wouldn't have had trouble getting out. So I got to Kenya, and in Nairobi, now of course by then I'd already got into the refugee, business establishment or affairs. And indeed, I didn't get help where I needed it. Again, the same group, they know themselves, so maybe someday one of them will speak up. You can imagine people who, they've been on my case this whole time and in all these countries, and they still, pursue me And they can't tell me what it is I've done to them or what it is that they have against me. But so in Nairobi, I really tried not to go back to camps. I'd seen a bit of the horrors in the camps. So, and in Kenya, I was told I was free to live in Nairobi. In fact, I was free to start my life all over. But by then, so I really needed to cool down first and then try to reorganize my life. But there is a dilemma as well. Now, if my own country, my own people don't need my services, who else will want my services? So that has been the whole point, I think, that I need to clarify. And so I needed time to cool down and plan my life. But then it became impossible. But I need to just briefly again to mention these children and the horrors they experience and they grow into. So I lived in the what do they call them? Unplanned settlements especially Westland. I went to several, so I have an idea of what life is like in those places. And I've been to Kinondoni as well in Tanzania, though not in this period of refugee seeking, but previously. So I know what life is like in those places, and what is done to the children in those places still is really, really causes grief in heaven. Now, in that neighborhood, the day I got someone helped me to rent a room. The very first night, someone tried to attack me. And the landlord speak up, and these are people who are always high on stuff, on things. So he spoke, called out someone's name, a woman in the neighborhood, and spoke a few things. And then each time he would get, high on whatever he was consuming, he would come again and speak up outside my door, making threats. And so I was like, I have an idea what it is they tell these youths, which is false, but unfortunately, many of them get to believe it. And so this is how they turn into monsters. So in the end, I couldn't live in Nairobi without a source of income. And I was like, maybe I do what everybody else does. So grudgingly, I went to a refugee camp in Kenya, in Kakuma. Again, the very first few nights, attempts to attack me. And usually the reception areas are really plastic sheeting. The shelters are made from plastic sheeting, so they simply cut. They just, slice them and walk in. And now with those threats, for a while, I lived at, at the either at the gate of the reception center or right at the gate of the UNHCR, at their main office. And then when I saw they were not helping, I was like, maybe this is my, not even destiny, I don't know what to call it. It's like, yeah, maybe this is how God planned my life to end. So I decided I was ready to go to the camp. I was given a plastic sheeting shelter again. These are planned neighborhoods with roads running around, so you would think it's more like planned living. Except I was lucky I was awake, in still in the wild. So I had what felt like legs of an insect, and this is a place with many what are they called? Those insects that bite. I remember the name. So I thought it was one of those. I didn't have a torch, so I couldn't reach for my matchbox, so I just sat up. So by the time these guys try to climb, I was awake. And then they are so arrogant and with so much impunity, they come speaking, talking as they try to climb. So I made an alarm, and they didn't even bother to move. They kept trying on, but I persisted, and eventually they left. The neighbors, they're just feet away, like you would maybe not even 10 feet. But it took like half an hour before they showed up. And so when they did show up, one of the old woman was like, did she think she was going to live in this place by herself? And then soon they went back into their own houses. So I asked them, I wanted to go to the police station. I was told, oh, they are so not far from here. In fact, they must have heard the alarm you made. Wow. So what I did was to sit outside the whole night. And of course, these guys, the people who had tried to break in, didn't go far. Shortly after, I could hear them walking and opening and going into shelters not far from my own. So that's the kind of impunity. So it's I think it's more like a tacit agreement between the criminal gangs and those who are supposed to provide security. And the other irony is that the lady in charge of security defense, she was right behind my shelter, and she only showed up I think a day or two after. And when I asked her about it, she was like, oh, you made an alarm. So that kind of attitude. So at dawn, I went to so I was told it was not safe to walk to the police at night. Anyway, it was useless. But I did, the next day is when I walked over, because this time the gangs came even before dark. It was just a little bit dusk. So I decided to walk to the police station, and it wasn't far indeed. Now, by that time, the guy I found on duty was completely drunk, shouting on top of his voice. He was watching a soccer match, and the things he was asking me were not really professional or helpful, so I decided to keep quiet and just stand outside. Since he wasn't receiving me, I wasn't even free to sit down even at the veranda, so I just kept standing. Eventually, he told me if I could bear the mosquitoes, I was welcome to spend the night at the veranda, and that's what I did. So the following morning, that's when I moved to go to speak to the UNHCR office at that, in town. Now, this drunk policeman, I remember those red eyes, he did show up after a while. So they came, they arrested me from the UNHCR office. I spent close to 6 months in prison. I developed health complications because of these many years of, difficult life and all, metabolic disorders, all sorts of disorders, and allergies had also grown out of control. So heat was a problem, extreme cold was a problem, and this place being a arid place, it was really, really hot. And I was locked up in prison, in a place that is not ventilated, no food, because I feed on specific diet because of the metabolic disorders. So I could have died in prison. So I mentioned this because I need to show the insecurity and what happens. Now, the policeman who had, given me that attitude in the camp was now at the police station and was one of the two that came to arrest me. The second one, I'd always seen him, but I'd never spoken to him. Now, most of the policemen and women were very friendly and very good to me. And when I mention these evil individuals in every establishment, please note that most of the rest are good, godly individuals that do their very best to serve the communities. So it has nothing to do with every one of them. Just these few individuals, and I think the Lord wanted us to see and expose them so that humanity will know why he removed them from their midst. So the second guy, I had never spoken with him, but so he came, and from behind, which is wrong. I heard a voice from, he was a tall guy, so a voice from behind and above me, and it's like Panda Gali, which is Swahili for to get onto the pickup. So I turned to face him, and then he pushed me, we grabbed I had a cotton cloth and it got torn, and he used force to push me, and I saw no point in arguing with him. But I had, like I said, most of the colleagues of his were friendly, so I knew if he took me to the police station, then I would, at least his colleagues would be there, I was safe. So these two, they tried to shout at me, throw insults at me, just to get me to maybe act angrily towards them, and then they would claim I insulted them or I abused them. So now the issue would shift from there being no case for my arrest to my conduct. But I didn't give them a chance. Thanks be to God. I had my composure. Like I said, really, God has taken good care of me. So at the police station, now I was mixed with those they had arrested for disorderly conduct. And we were taken to court. Those who had done that, they accepted it. They accepted the offense, and they were forgiven. These are refugees. They claim, all sorts of excuses. So they were forgiven. Now, in my training, professional training, you cannot get a public service position if you have ever been convicted. So these guys now are trying to have me to convict myself. So again, no chance, unfortunately. And as I remember this, when I was put into a truck to be taken to prison, I was like, now this is remand. So yeah, so the close to 6 months in prison was on remand. And there being no cases, I remember the prison's women would tell me, the wardresses, they would tell me those policemen would never come to court to accuse, to produce evidence of my wrongdoing. But specific the policemen, the big tall guy came to me when he came to take me to court the second time, and he sat me in a waiting room. It was just the two of us, and then he's like, why were you resisting arrest? So I guess you see now that would have been the charge now, resisting arrests, fighting policemen, those of discipline issues. So I was lucky, I'd already been told about him. So he had been sent. If I was to resist arrest, he was to break every bone in my body. And if I tried to run, he would have shot. So those were the things he was told to do. And so when he was asking me why I had resisted arrest, I told him, no, this is what the Lord has told me about you. And my job is done. I've told you, so deal with it with God himself. So on the last visit, I call it a visit, but my last trip to court, he showed up again. And that's when he said he had been sent. I don't have to ask who sent him. But afterwards, the Lord told me it was his officer in charge of the station. And the Lord promised to punish him. I don't have to follow up, really. It's none of my business. But it's between him and God Almighty. So I wanted to point out the impunity, the lawlessness, even before these revolutions had taken place. So you can imagine the lawlessness, the impunity, the violence that would have followed any breakdown in order. But more importantly, the children. So out of this, I think the takeaway is very simple. I wanted to tell this story, one, to show why I haven't been able to meet my needs, and to show that there is this network, this large group, but they are not as powerful as they think, because the Lord is almighty. And I've just been given an extra 50 plus years to live, so I'll get to live a long, happy life. So they haven't really affected me the way they think, but they have affected those vulnerable people. Most of the people who helped me financially were struggling families as well. Some of them, they struggled on afterwards, and so it's painful, and those evil people are responsible. My landlord in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I owed him $1,500. He was a 93-year-old man at the time, Armenian genocide survivor, bipolar, and his son, who was over 50, was bipolar also. So they needed every penny, and each time I remember them, I feel a lot of grief. The Lord I serve is a God of miracles. Who knows, maybe I'll live to speak to them and pay off that money. But it's been painful, and a lot of other families. So when I speak about how they've hurt people, it's really what I have seen, what I've seen up close. But so the impunity with which they do it, but more importantly, what it is they wanted to do that we're not able to do. Now, that was 2013 to about 2020. I got out of Kenyan prison in 2020 July, end of July. And the Lord told me to return to Uganda, to the place he had showed me. It was difficult for me to do so, but I knew I was threatened with the punishment if I didn't do it. So I was like, okay, what do I do? So I came back. But even before I came back, I'd been told to write a grant request for an economic development project. This is what I love to do. I used to do this before I got into trouble. I really love it, and I still hope to do for the rest of my life. things to do with economic development, prosperity. I'll do a separate video for Project Prosperity. So that's what I wanted to do. And so when I returned, I wanted to write the project right away. That was 2022. I'd even discussed with some local government officials that would work with, and we had agreed after the elections of 2021 that would proceed. Now, just a few days before the elections ended, I was again put in prison. This is the military prison that I spoke about before. And the ordeals, again, I've witnessed impunity. I don't know how many people die in prison for no, crimes they have not committed. I've met women who have lost their children. Again, when I speak about children, it's things I've seen. Women who are in prison after they've lost their husbands, they are accused of killing those husbands when they haven't. And in the process, the children who are left without parents and they're lost. So I think that will make more sense if we get to visit those women and to follow up their cases. They're not difficult to follow up. I think there's time for everything, and there will be time for that. So I got into this because I wanted to talk about the project writing phase. Now, as soon as I began to work on the project, I had particular families that knew me right from 2013 that I've lived with and worked with, and so they understand what I'm trying to do, and I knew I could start with those and demonstrate how the ideas work, and then what we need to do after that. One particular family, the most committed, the breadwinner, she's female, she was advised to go to the Middle East for domestic employment. Now, she came to ask for my advice, and I told her I could not tell her whether to go or not, so it's really difficult for me. But then the Lord told me to inform her that she would end up losing, she would have her organs harvested. And I told her that, and she still went. So in the process, it became difficult for me to find groups to work with. That's the basic message out of this. So the lady is yet to come back, so we don't know if she will make it back or not. But she has that risk around her. Now, the tragedy is, all the years I saw her struggle, more than 10 on my part, and I think she struggled for many more before that. No one had ever offered to help her. And then out of this experience, now of course, she's overseas, and she's left her young children and elderly mother without a care provider. So this is how tragic the whole thing gets the whole time. We are yet to see how it ends, but I feel for those families, and I pray that the Lord will, end this ordeal sooner. Yeah. But Amalek, so out of all this, Amalek is not only exposed, but really weakened. No chance, no chance, no chance. Now, this is like a by the way, but it's related. Again, I had one of those moments when I'm like, but why does God let all these things happen? And then I remembered, those who have read Ezekiel 38 and 39, it speaks about the war of Gog, of Magog, and how that puts the end to evil. So this is relevant because I've shared a lot of prophecies about the wars that are shaping up in Europe. And so the realization that came to my mind says, out of the preliminary conflicts, wars, a completely new configuration will emerge in Europe. Darker, more evil, and people will be shocked. Those who are in for war don't know what they are trying, they are inviting. And so that will be Gog of Magog consolidating, and that's the force that will, do the things that are talked about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And so that's how evil will be removed from the midst of humanity. It is tragic, as you can see, lots of lives getting lost along the way. Only the Lord knows